While scary stories are likely older than recorded history, horror media has existed for little more than a century, and is something of a bastard genre. But what is horror? Something that is scary simply isn't comprehensive, and naming it as anything including monsters or supernatural elements is similarly useless. It's a genre born in film, and while Gothic horror and many horror themes predated cinema, nothing approaching what can contemporarily be called horror appeared before cameras became involved. Horror is therefore not truly a genre insofar as its narrative elements are concerned. Rather, it is a unique physical and symbolic spatial relationship that takes shape within a narrative world. Horror is not driven by its abstract elements, but instead by its spatial ones. Thusly, as a genre, it is best described not merely as horror, but as the construction of an architecture of horror. This architecture takes shape across decades of oscillating subgenres and is often ambiguous. However, there are commonalities which give the term use and specificity. Whether it be a monster movie or a slasher flick, horror is always more than just a reflection of society's fears. Much has been said about how certain subgenres are the product of contemporary anxieties, slasher flicks being suburban angst, extraterrestrial themes paralleling the arrival of new technologies in the space race. This is not entirely wrong, but it simplifies the genre to the point of redundancy. The focus should instead be on how these anxieties are reflected, how they take shape in space and time in narrative fiction, and how they inform the use of space, which is so unique to horror. Getting scared the old-fashioned way is first and foremost an exercise in fanaticism and a declaration of appreciation for the genre. If for nothing else, this is because most horror movies prior to the 1980s are simply not technically impressive compared to what is made today. Despite this, or maybe because of it, there will always be people who return to The Exorcist or The Thing, bemoaning the fact that horror movies today aren't like what they, or in some cases their parents, grew up with. There are, of course, various fresh takes on this paragenre, which help it to break with simply being an exercise in nostalgia. Additionally, these films usually offer an obsession with either reflexive movements or technologies, though we'll discuss that later. They enter into a discursive space of horror insofar as it affects the anxieties of the nation as a social body, or the body as a distinct entity in relation to the enemies of the social body. As a result, they are very much old-fashioned in their fears, often thoroughly patriarchal or imperialistic in disposition, even if they are more recent than their successor subgenres. The first instance often comes as a reckoning with the past, usually in violent fashion. The specters of the past return to haunt those occupying the present space, either in a macro-historical or familial context. In Stanley Kubrick's The Shining, a macro-historical vengeance takes place upon the grounds of the Overlook Hotel, with the implication being that this is a cyclical process. The film opens with a sweeping shot of the landscape of Colorado, scored with deeply ominous music, implying that the land itself is haunted by what took place there. This is punctuated by a later line from one of the hotel managers.
Oh, it's still hard for me to believe it actually happened here. But it did.
Notably, Jack's son Danny states that he learned of the Donner Party from television as they drive towards the hotel for the first time, doubling down on the hotel manager's distancing of the past by adding a new virtuality to American history. History is not just out of reach, it is indeed unreal or hyper-real. This also extends to the hotel's various spirits and apparitions, all of whom are virtual bodies resuscitated by the architecture they once inhabited in order to further service its symbolic efforts. The Overlook itself is described as illustrious and has various rooms named after states such as the Colorado Lounge, which is said to have entertained jet-setters and movie stars, or all the best people. The manager also tells the Torrance family, if you feel like spreading out, you have the rest of the hotel to move around in, as well as informing them of the fact that the hotel was built on an Indian burial ground. In this way, the hotel takes on the burden of being America, but localized within a microscopic or microcosmic environment containing infinite plasticity and designed to accommodate its wealthy patrons or citizens above all else, constructed upon the now desacralized land of a colonized people. Even more bluntly, Jack later encounters a phantasmic bartender, Lloyd, who he makes various remarks to, including invocations of the white man's burden and lines of credit. Jack also immediately recognizes and shows no sign of concern at the appearance of Lloyd, or later, a large party of jazz-aged partiers in the ballroom where he is drinking. Jack's comments, coupled with his familiarity, suggest a vision of the American patriarch and society at large, which is concerned with and constituted by a constant sense of paternalism and financial extension, codified in lines of credit. A patriarch who is always comfortable slipping into an imperial past. Indeed, the hotel is an environment constructed to invoke this past for its guests, and the invocation is extended to its supernatural elements. The Overlook is therefore defined by this plasticity in the service of invoking a certain symbolic or gestural system, which is oftentimes only virtual. Following this logic, Wendy and Danny escape at the film's conclusion represents both the expulsion and escape of the feminine other from a hostile architecture, specifically a capitalist and patriarchal imperial architecture. Jack, however, remains trapped, literally frozen, within the hotel grounds, transported back in the past and locked within a photograph of a 4th of July celebration. The connotation being that the American patriarch is also trapped within this revelry, unable to transcend the imperial codification which creates, or perhaps invokes him in the first place. This architecture is also the architecture of a haunted house at its very core, whereas the Overlook specifies this to the American experience by transporting the haunted house into a haunted hotel, literally an intersection between homestead and commerce. The haunted house does this at the level of familial psychodrama. This is observable in the virtual theaters of haunted houses, from the Addams Family movies and television show to the Amityville Horror, though it is perhaps best expressed by the television series The Haunting of Hill House. The show is not old, but does give fresh voice in service of getting scared in a way that is in line with the formal genre rules its predecessors operated on. The series does this in service of exploring multi-generational trauma, encapsulating this survey in several key aspects. These being the way it portrays ghosts, hallucinatory episodes, and how these two elements interact. One of the main takeaways impressed on the viewers is that ghosts are most often a wish, a phrase used several times by a few different characters. This is used for a horror effect in various hallucinations induced upon characters both in and outside of the titular Hill House, as well as how the show's ghosts, which haunt the main cast of 6 siblings and their parents, are experienced as various personal demons. Luke, an addict who grew up in the house alongside the main cast made up of his 5 siblings, is haunted by a man who always follows him at 7 paces, standing in for the addiction which haunts him in his efforts to get sober. Similarly, the father of the siblings sees his wife who died in the house with him all the time. The rest of the siblings experience similar hallucinations, dreams, or literal ghosts. Well, perhaps the most interesting of these is Nell, Luke's twin sister, who sees the bent neck lady. This figure appears with a crooked neck and follows her both in the past and present across the show's 2 timelines, which cover the siblings' childhood and adult years. The figure appears during her various personal tragedies as if to punctuate them, notably the death of her husband, and is later, through a rather terrifying moment, revealed to actually be Nell herself. If this sounds confusing, it's because it is, but the long and short of it is that Nell returns to the house to confront her demons, only to be tricked by the house into taking her own life in almost the exact same manner and almost the exact same spot her mother did some 20 years previously. The sequence leading up to this depicts her seeing her husband and family. She enters the house and dancing with the former throughout a restored Hill House, interspersed with shots of her wandering through the now abandoned and dilapidated structure completely alone. When she kills herself, she experiences the noose she puts over her own neck as a necklace being placed there by her revived mother. The scene where she actually dies depicts her first falling and breaking her neck, and continues as she falls into all the previous scenes of the bent neck lady, with her, of course, being the bent neck lady. In effect, the bent neck lady saga visually primes the audience to understand the depth of her break with reality in the moment, a moment which constructs the haunted house as one similar to the Overlook, while emphasizing the elements of plasticity which define Hill House's environment as a distinct architecture. The house is thereby contrasted with the subordinated and sterile plasticity of the Overlook, which only invokes the virtual past and gains new freedom in its plasticity insofar as it becomes a theater of this plasticity organized around lack. Architecture which takes on this plasticity is capable of overcoding its own physical, spatial qualities in order to better capture desire within a theater of unconscious projection in a manner that literalizes the Freudian subconscious. A ghost is a wish, a ghost is lack, and therefore the physical space which houses them is also constituted by this lack. The environment can change to accommodate this lack in an infinite number of ways, most literally within a room in the house, which becomes a tree house or game room or reading room for various family members. Whatever you as the inhabitant lack, the house can provide. Additionally, time takes on this plasticity as well. Characters appearing in hallucinations, or as ghosts in some cases, tend to change age, and characters returning to the house as adults relive their past or childhood trauma through hallucinatory episodes. The significance of this is that physical space within architectures of horror becomes subordinated to psychic spaces, spaces which serve to allow you to rehearse your lack. As demonstrated in Nell's hallucinations, you can see your husband again, you can see your daddy or mommy again, but it's precisely because you lack them that you get to see them, to rehearse and dance with them, and then they kill you. And you must be killed, because haunted houses are above all ghost factories. They make them and export them in the form of trauma in order to perpetuate lack and to keep the theater going. In The Haunting of Hill House, all those who live and die within the house are trapped there forever and are locked into participating in this harassment of the living. And in this way, the closed familial loop is codified within a system of theatrical lack projection. And the architecture serves to engender this by being infinitely generative, indestructible, and rearrangeable. Everything is up for debate as far as reality is concerned when architecture has no deference to reality. The spaces and places of haunted house films and the like depict structures which are cursed ground, structures which exist in near infinite plasticity for the people who inhabit them as much as they do the audience. These structures are presumed to be haunted and are haunted in a way which suggests that any legitimate or functional architectural facet is entirely arbitrary. The other type of haunting is the haunting which is brought upon a previously unassuming structure. Films like The Exorcist depict the foreign reflux of imperial or familial psychodrama as opposed to the inherency of this state within the structures of The Shining or The Haunting of Hill House. To elaborate, The Exorcist opens in northern Iraq with unmistakably foreign music scoring shots of an archaeological dig where the statue of a demon responsible for the title's titular exorcism is found. This introduction depicts the landscape as not just a foreign other, but a foreign other which is almost cosmically so, resembling the surface of Mars more than anything Western audiences are familiar with. We continue through Iraq, seeing primitively industrial machine shops and imperial outposts, cementing within the viewer's head that this is a savage land. The sequence in Iraq ends with a shot of the statue of Pazuzu, again scored with decidedly un-Western music. The significance of this is that the viewer is instructed to see the foreign idol, which is literally a hunk of unassuming stone, as deeply ominous and sinister. As such, when the demon invades a purely functional homescape in DC's upscale Georgetown neighborhood, this is a violation of both the literal and symbolic functions of imperialism. The frontier returns to revenge itself upon the beneficiaries of its plunder, and the Georgetown home lights up with a fantastic newfound plasticity. This transition, or restaging of the home as a haunted house, can be demonstrated by a comparison of the house's functions and its interruption. The house, pre-possession, is one which is infinitely functional. Its occupants, a well-to-do actress and her daughter Regan, do not cook or clean and instead employ a staff to service the house. The occupants of the house embrace this functionality in service of what Baudrillard referred to as a gestural system of control in his work The System of Objects. This gestural system of control stands in marked contrast to an earlier gestural system of effort, in which objects in the domestic sphere no longer exist to serve a functional purpose in the traditional sense, but rather constitute an articulated order in which objects are mobile, manipulable, and constituted by their interactivity with the body as much as by their aesthetic symbolic communication with each other. As such, the occupants of the house in the film don't cook in the kitchen and they don't eat in the dining room. Rather, these spaces become adjacent spaces for entertainment and play, which only exist as vestigial entities. This is clearly demarcated as a space to play and entertain as much, if not more so, as it is one to live in. As such, the demon's ability to interrupt this play, shown when Regan promptly ends her mother's party by urinating on the carpet in full view of her guests, that truly makes it vital. The economic system of imperialism is only permitted insofar as it does not interrupt the symbolic order of the mother country. Great pains are also taken to depict the inability of science to diagnose Regan's possession and the exorcism, a cultural symbolic act of dual repression and expulsion of the foreign other, is the only thing that finally ends the problem. The actual spatial significance of the exorcism itself does not center around the traditional or symbolic functions of religion, however, and instead displays the logic of the functional space. The demon is able to break objects, cause them to float, and generally disrupt the layout of Regan's carefully curated bedroom, and textually subordinates the priest to the role of enforcing the spatial dominance of functionality rather than any metaphysical purpose within the space. They are doing the exorcism as much to save the comfort of the symbolic system of control as they are to save Regan. Houses that become haunted are therefore not haunted in the descriptive sense, but in the active sense. This haunting is a reflexive movement of alterity, be it in the imperial context or some other way, attempting to disrupt the symbolic order that constitutes the architecture of the house as a functional operation. Additionally, if places that are haunted represent this reflexive movement across borders, then spaces that have always been haunted represent a reflexive movement across time. Following the previous section, it seems appropriate to explore the relationship between architectures of horror, architectures of real space, and architectures of the body. Architectures of the body typically act as an overcoding process in which an other rewrites the form it invades. Perhaps the best example of this is the werewolf, which constantly oscillates between civilized and feral modes. Primarily, the werewolf in any media always acts as a case of radical overcoding, in which a primitive or feral Noumena overtakes a civilized body. In both 1981's American Werewolf in London and 1941's The Wolfman, the main characters are city dwellers, venturing into the countryside only to be set upon by an anachronistic terror. While the technical limitation of the latter's time prevent any meaningful transformation scene, the one included in the film is almost comical by today's standards. It does accomplish the minimum requirements of depicting this overcoding. It's in American Werewolf in London, which won an Academy Award for its special effects, that this process begins to take on its full meaning. The transformation in this film is brutal, involving bones breaking and regrowing in new patterns, introducing a surplus of hair and fangs to the protagonist David's body. In a sense, the body becomes a private architecture of horror, destroyed and rebuilt in the same manner as any haunted house, reinstilling forms on an ad hoc basis to construct the werewolf. The significance of the body is not the end of the story, however, as these massive surpluses are translated beyond that of primitive Noumena and take on the significance of a technology when it comes to the question of how those bodies interact with architecture. In Judith Halberstrom's article, Technology's a Monstrosity, Bram Stoker's Dracula, she touches on this relationship through its namesake, Technology's a Monstrosity. Technologies of monstrosity are purpose-built monsters that embody the multiplicity of otherness, condensing a foreign enemy and creating an obvious target for heroes to destroy. In The Exorcist, Pazuzu functions in accordance with this technology, condensing a thinly veiled other and the weakness this exposes within the decadence of the Western child-rearing pathology into one body, which can be targeted for a symbolic act of cleansing. In the case of the werewolf, as a technology, the werewolf is an overcoated body, entering the modern metropolis as a disruptive force. As Halberstrom says of Dracula, in the context of the novel, Dracula is otherness itself, a distilled version of all others, produced by and within the fictional texts, sexual science, and psychopathology. Similarly, the werewolf is a technology, embodying otherness in the most primitive and savage sense, rather than an ethnic sexuality, as in the case of the vampire. This savageness extends to both the land and the people that inhabit it, as the wolfman inextricably ties lycanthropy to gypsies, engaging in a technology of ethnic paranoia. The American Werewolf in London is less specific with its demography, but still posits the werewolf as a provincial technology of the rural working class, an aberration allowed to exist because it only affects proverbial hicks. The significance of the movie's technology is much greater than that of the Wolfman, however, as it takes it into the modern metropolis. The Wolfman, as a technology, therefore becomes a primal and provincial force, wreaking havoc upon the functionality of the metropolis. David, in the movie, invades a private home, zoos, a pornographic movie theater, and finally the streets of the city itself, disrupting the flow of traffic at the heart of the city. Urban life, which is so subdivided, segmented, and cellular in nature, where every function has a corresponding location and physical architecture codified in zoning, is exploded by the werewolf. The localization of various parts of life, the domestic, entertainment, and sexual spheres, are all unified in a trail of provincial carnage. The engine of this dynamic resistance is the body of the Wolfman, and this body as technology is also a body as architecture. This is the case due to the fact that a technology of monstrosity is not the body itself, but the body is a physics of motion. Dracula's body is not a technology, neither is the Wolfman's, as these are simply the impetus for the construction of the monster, the materials, as it were. They inform what the other is, how it functions, and how it can be reflected in flesh, but the body itself is always that of architecture. This is why when we say the body as technology, it is as technology. But when we speak of the body as architecture, it is in the most literal sense. The body is architecture. In the same way, the Overlook or Hill House are constituted by a rehearsed plasticity accomplished through overcoating. So is the body of the traditional monster. If the haunted house continually reconstitutes itself and projects a psychic architecture over its physical one, changing hallways and interior layouts, or invoking past versions of themselves in the present, then the body of the monster reconstitutes its flesh. Teeth are exchanged for fangs, skin for fur, bones break and recodify themselves in new patterns, all with a marked difference that makes this body distinct from that of man. What comes after, then? In the years since the totalizing Reagan era and the fall of the USSR, and the impending end of history everyone finds themselves in, how are we to get scared the old-fashioned way in the face of capitalism's achievement of complete consensus? This world is one in which all possibilities are foreclosed, and to quote Mark Fisher, it is easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. How can we possibly be scared by monsters or what goes bump in the night? Does it really even matter? There's no precarity to life in a world in which life is cheap, and if Dracula doesn't get me, global warming probably will. Media, therefore, adapts to reflect the attitudes of its consumer and becomes increasingly cynical, self-referential, and prone to parody. Thus, we enter the domain of the slasher movie and its later iteration of the depressive thriller, and even later, the ultimate condensation of these themes into the self-referential parody. There are two subgenres which typify, or rather trace in real time, the decline of expectations among moviegoers. The first is a slasher movie. Think Voorhees, Mike Myers, Leatherface, etc. The latter of these is an early entry into the subgenre and represents a turn in what even constitutes horror as a broad term. Gone are the large, spooky castles or monsters, and they are instead replaced by a lower budget, gorier, and more critical and pessimistic environment and cast. The horror in Texas Chainsaw is not that of the Wolfman or the haunted house. It's instead rural Texas, its poverty, its culture, and its people. The most striking thing about the slasher turn is the lack of technologies and the degraded architecture of both bodies and space. Everything and everyone is severely depleted. The businesses and houses in the film are either dirty or in poor repair, so it's clear as to why architectures, at least physical ones, can be labeled dilapidated. But why do technologies become impossible in such a space? In contrast with the aggregate powers of technologies of monstrosity, the villains or antagonists of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre are not a distilled version of all others produced within the text, but rather a singular and obvious other, that of poverty in rural America. In the postmodern horror movie, horror is no longer a monster or an other which infests an architecture of bodies or space. Rather, it is bodies and spaces themselves. There is nothing which possesses the family of serial killers in the movie to act, and they are not acted upon by any form of other. Rather, they are the other. It should be noted that Texas Chainsaw predates other films which can be determined as old-fashioned, such as 1980's The Shining, and arrived only a year after 1973's The Exorcist. But it denotes a new wave of horror not purely in its periodization as much as it does in its attitude. The film reflects this mood in its depiction not just of the protagonists, broke hippie-esque types, but also in its killer. In the house where the killer is first encountered, there is an adornment of the walls with animal heads as trophies, as well as a shrine of bones of various victims, with the audible buzzing of flies heard. The message is clear. The people of America's periphery not only live in squalor, but have constructed ad hoc ritual in order to stave off a relentless decoding offensive by capital. Amidst globalization, liberalization, and the complete collapse of what once was, the choice to embrace jerry-rigged ritual structure is as rational as any other, even if it involves serial murder and cannibalism. This psychosocial collapse is even stronger in the film's climax, when the sole surviving female protagonist, Sally, is confronted by the entire family of killers. They reconstruct a Norman Rockwell-style family dinner, with the decrepit body of their patriarch present, and Leatherface's mask is adorned in traditionally feminine makeup. In an effort to sustain patriarchal traditional structures, members of the family must now perform double roles, increasingly reinstituting Oedipal structures even as they collapse under the weight of economic reality. What efforts must one resort to in order to sustain America's family in 1974? Well, this, apparently. This is an architecture of desacralization and an intermittent ritual amid a rapidly deindustrializing hellscape. The second sort of movie in this period is the cynical thriller. While not technically horror, it distinguishes itself as relevant to the horror genre due to its nature as a substitute or successor genre. It deals with the desacralized world and the horrors of what comes after nothing can be horrifying. Brutal serial killings, rape, murder. These things aren't scary, rather they're inherent to the modern liberal democratic society. The world becomes darker. Emotion is not heightened into terror, but rather muted into sullen resignation. Take 1995's Seven, for instance. The film deals with two detectives, one who's just transferred to the unnamed city of the film's setting, and the other who's on the verge of retirement. The world of the film is dingy and seemingly always raining, with a muted color palette that reflects a profound lack of life transpiring within. The titular 7 murders are shockingly brutal, with various killings taking place via force feeding or year-long starvation, but all signify a certain commitment, which is noted as kind of rare nowadays by one of the characters. Indeed, it is only the killer who has this commitment, as he remains uncaught for most of the film, is only apprehended once he turns himself in. In the climactic scene, as the duo of detectives escort the killer to the scene of the promised final murder, there is a heavily militarized police presence in the form of convoys and helicopters, and the killer finally explains himself somewhat. He states things to the effect of, "It doesn't matter who I am. Who I am means absolutely nothing," and says of those he killed that only in a world this shitty could you even try to say that these were innocent people and keep a straight face. The killer, like almost every other character in the film, accepts a sort of depersonalization that comes with inhabiting the modern cityscape, though he weaponizes it to a degree that other characters seem incapable of. Brad Pitt's Detective Mills attempts to label the killer insane and says that "you're no Messiah, you're a movie of the week." Attempts at medicalization and explaining away the symptoms of social and economic decline should be fairly evident in today's world, but the underlying thesis is that anyone dissatisfied with the world as it is must simply be crazy. Look at all of this. How could you not like all of this? The drive ultimately leads to the infamous moment in which the head of Mills's wife, Tracy, is delivered to the scene in a box, and the killer elaborates that he purchased their home information from a fellow officer under the guise of being a member of the press. Incompetence and corruption within civil structures is not a coincidence in this plan. Rather, the plan relies upon it and could not have been executed without it. After the reveal that Tracy was pregnant, Mills shoots the killer, becoming the seventh and final sin of wrath. Following this, someone in the helicopter can be heard saying, "Somebody call somebody." All of this serves to construct a new architecture of the modern metropolis, an architecture of profound incompetence and shittiness, to borrow a term used by the characters. Public services and infrastructure break down in real time, being thoroughly compromised from within, and even then, all anyone can think to do is call somebody. This architecture is one without horror, a skeleton creature from hell which is riding itself into the abyss on the promise that it can keep going, despite all evidence to the contrary. All failings are blamed on the world and how shitty it is, with no question as to how it got this way. What economic or political forces might be behind this is never a question that comes up. There is no alternative to capitalism or social democracy. Instead, we must simply suffer the consequences of them. This is a world which is truly post-horror, and the results are much more terrifying in scope and scale than what preceded it. Movies like Seven embodied the post-horror of the 90s, but they were nothing in comparison to what was to come in the following decades. After events like 9/11 and the 2008 recession, it became clear that the melancholic, grunge-infused mess of the decade after the fall of the Soviet Union was the wrong reaction. Whereas Seven posits a libidinal depletion of sorts, embodied in a rotting architecture of total decline, the new century would rather be characterized by a total abolition of the libido, a sexless and symbolic functionality. Libido was not being subsumed, it was being wiped out on the atomic level, and naturally it follows that media should reflect this trend. Indeed, whereas horror had previously been undermined, it has now been totally abolished. But how has this abolition been accomplished? Horror, in its new form, is not the architecture of the body or even of decline, but rather the architecture of denial. In this new body of work, often taking the form of parody or the seemingly paradoxical horror comedy, decline takes on a new form as fodder for laughs from the audience. We are invited out from the cold world of collapse and promised that it's okay, because we get it. Things are bad, but there is some metatextual joke to be found within it all. In fact, this metatextuality becomes a stand-in for any real feelings of fear that we may have about the world. To borrow a term from a video by Maggie Mae Fish on Fight Club, horror media becomes a fetish object, or an expression of denial of lack. We construct our media in such a way that horror denies any horror, any real terror at the reality of the world. In this way, we can celebrate our fear in much the same way a student might celebrate a poor grade on something they knew they were going to fail anyways. This is embodied by films such as 2008's Zombieland or 2011's The Cabin in the Woods. The former portrays a world following a zombie outbreak, opening with shots of the White House lawn, a football stadium, a downtown area, a suburban neighborhood, and a prison, all overrun by hordes of zombies. Each of these places are unmistakably American, but it's delivered in such a way that it is impossible to mistake it for anything but comedic in tone. At exactly the 5-minute mark, Jesse Eisenberg's character remarks to the audience, "I'm in Garland, Texas, and it may look like zombies destroyed it, but that's actually just Garland." In the postmodern context, when it has thoroughly set in and all the shock has subsided, the apocalypse comes as a relief. The entire premise of that joke operates on the idea that the audience will implicitly relate to the feeling that the world is so bad that it would be better off ending, and in fact the joke would not work otherwise. Perhaps we feel that we are already living in an apocalypse, as with Garland, and the symbolic order has yet to catch up to material reality. In doing so, the writers actually accomplished something fairly incredible, as this joke would not really work in any previous time. What audience in the 50s, 70s, or even 90s would look at the fall of their own country, especially in such an embarrassing and impotent fashion as is portrayed in Zombieland, and feel a sense of relatability, humor, or relief? The final line of 7, delivered as Morgan Freeman's character watches the fallout of the film's climax, is Ernest Hemingway once said, "The world is a fine place and worth fighting for." I agree with the second part. The message here is clear. We are no longer supposed to agree with the second part. The second film mentioned above, Cabin in the Woods, follows this same basic structure insofar as declined subsumption in the fetish object is concerned, though it more artfully articulates the plasticity of the postmodern horror landscape's unique architecture. The architecture of this horror is less organic, as it's not a plasticity of otherness, but instead a plasticity of the body, of capital money's spontaneous generation. The events of the Cabin in the Woods literalize this, as all the monsters that appear in the film are revealed to be controlled by an organization responsible for the containment, release, and theme park-esque narrativizing of the slaughter of the main characters. It's later explained that all of this is part of some elaborate ritual, but the specifics of the film's events are that of an office space, not a horror movie. There are in fact several possible storylines which the main characters could have chosen based on the whims of the staff who are running and monitoring the events of the movie, each of these some variation on a classic horror movie trope. As such, there is no longer a soul technology or body engaged within an architecture, nor is there an architecture which has a will of its own, as in the case of the haunted house. Rather, the events are staged, put on, so to speak, and must be done so in premeditated fashion. This is a symbolic order, to be sure, but one which is purely functional and data-driven in nature. Technology upgrades and eclipses any possibility of multiplicity of action or outcome. In its place is singular purpose. Everything is rearrangeable, transient, and momentary, but there is no grand design behind this plasticity. The plasticity itself is the point. Whereas before, there was a singular symbolic order driving at a multiplicity of resolution, this has been replaced by a plastic, articulable symbolic order that exists to generate preordained outcomes as a computer would data. There is nothing signified by the witch or the slasher villain that the protagonists encounter in and around the cabin. Rather, they are signifiers of a signifier, a black hole of horror which has not been drained of content. Rather, it does not have any to begin with. This is not a traditional attack on bodies or space, or even on narrative, but an attack on the concept of narrative, an attack on meaning itself. Additionally, there are many movies in the post-horror period that attempt to genuinely frighten audiences. The Conjuring, the Sinister franchise, or Paranormal Activity franchise, to name a few. However, these films are often poorly received, go on to generate bloated IPs and unnecessary prequels, sequels, and spin-offs, and if not in tone, then at least in execution, make a strong case as to why horror is somewhat dead for the foreseeable future. Now that some ground has been covered in terms of what horror is as a genre, though this is nowhere near exhaustive, we can begin to work towards a more holistic definition of what an architecture of horror actually is. Up until this point, it has been explored as a plasticity and a multiplicity of space and time, as well as an infrastructure for their collapse within the symbolic order that these elements suspend in space and time. In order to accomplish this, it is necessary to consult what is possibly one of the greatest pieces of horror media of all time, Scooby-Doo, Where Are You? While the show may not be very scary to anyone older than 9, it does accomplish all the technical aspects of horror in surprisingly competent and efficient fashion. It's also noticeably ahead of its time, deconstructing horror in the desacralized space with its famous unmasking of the various monsters at the end of each episode. These monsters are at once bare-bones technologies, embodying an otherness at an age-appropriate level, though they really only do this insofar as they are clearly demarcated as monsters, as well as abolishing horror on the spot. What took Zombieland and Cabin in the Woods the turn of the 20th century to accomplish, the Scooby Gang was doing in the late 60s. The world of the show knows no murder, rape, or assault, and this is undeniably the result of it being children's programming. But the happy accident is that the motive is always economic. Someone wants a house, or a chest full of money, or Confederate gold, or to steal a circus, or some such ridiculous thing, so they dress up to scare people away in order to claim it. The monster is subordinated to the economic order, and frighteningly simplistic motive of the logic of capital money and asset accumulation. Desacralization delivered by Scooby-Doo, arriving from the future to demonstrate the coming hellscape of austerity. In doing so, at least for an audience of young children, the show can effectively have it both ways. It can at once demonstrate technologies and then destroy them as needed, and it does so every episode without fail. The real accomplishment of the show, however, is its prowess in defining the formal and functional aspects of the genre's architecture. The world of the show is one in which the environment is fully functional, articulated within a series of interactive elements. These elements are visually distinct and their animation is cleaner and crisper, as they involve movement and are articulable by characters in the show. For instance, a vase Shaggy crashes into may have darker, bolder lines and crisper animation that contrast a rather blurry and bland background. This animation quirk services the show, however, as it demonstrates the line between interactivity and its lack. Shaggy can only crash into that vase, not the vases next to it, and not the wall behind it, provided they are not highlighted in this way at least. The episodes follow a rigid structure, hitting story beats on a predictable schedule, and characters move through space in a correspondingly rigid manner, jumping from one interactive element to the next. There are often trapdoors, hidden passages, buttons, or levers as well, and this all gives the effect of the show being on rails, so to speak. Every structure, every museum, haunted house, or spooky building is all mapped out, all planned, designed, and equipped to convey a constant sense of movement. There is nothing that can be done which is not anticipated. The villain is always going to be caught, and the real possibilities exist in how this is accomplished, and how the space is conveyed and generated in order to accomplish this. Scooby characters, therefore, inhabit the purest and most distilled architecture of horror that has been discussed in this essay, as is the one which holds up the thinnest facade of existing independently from the plot, articulating perfectly that architectures of horror, as a rule, are never freestanding structures. Action heroes make use of their environment's surroundings, shooting red barrels to cause explosions and taking cover behind objects in the vicinity. Dramas, comedies, and so on show characters traversing environments naturally. Horror characters do not do this. Horror characters do not make double use of their environment. They are subject to their environments, animated by them, moved through them, and ultimately defined by them. To finally achieve a consistent definition of what architectures of horror actually are, extending to bodies and technologies, as well as spaces, we can synthesize some of the lessons from Scooby-Doo, Where Are You? These being, the environments of horror are planned and manipulable only as required to fully flesh out their characteristics. These environments engender motion in accordance with predetermined outcomes. Architectures of horror are spaces of simulacra, existing to resolve tensions within the internal symbolic order. All of the media discussed previously adhere to these rules in some sense, though some more strictly than others. and some more intensely at some points than others. But this is always the necessary prerequisite for designing worlds of horror or even post-horror. Finally, we get to the question of why this is relevant beyond creating a more consistent definition of horror. To explore horror as politics, history, and to understand how it further engenders these things, or rather their lack, it becomes unavoidable to drag capital back into the discussion. This time, capital is not a reference, it is not an input part in narrative, it is not a theme. This time, capital is the monster and the thing that killed it. Now, we discuss that horror, and the lack of it, were, are, and always will be the ultimate product of capital within culture. Considering that a definition of architectures of horror is now possible, it bears some mention of how capital influences these architectures. Capital itself has often gained a reputation for being somewhat horrific. Mark Fisher noted that Deleuze and Guattari described capitalism as a kind of dark potentiality which haunted all previous social systems, and Nick Land's collected essays are titled Fanged Noumena in reference to capital as a vampiric numen. Threads of this connect back to the earlier mention of the cynical thriller or horror parody subgenres, as these take shape as a direct result of horror's decline or abolition in the wake of an increasingly horrific reality. At the same time, we can go deeper. How does capital build these architectures? What makes architectures of horror inherent to capital, even if the spatial constructions themselves are at odds with capital? To return to Fisher, again referencing Deleuze and Guattari, he observes that in the years since Deleuze and Guattari wrote the 2 volumes of their Capitalism and Schizophrenia, it has seemed as if the deterritorializing impulses of capitalism have been confined to finance, leaving culture presided over by forces of reterritorialization. In short, layers, or strata, to invoke Land, of reality become untethered, slipping and sliding over each other. As capital attempts to slow decline in the deterritorializing process, its instinct to intermittently reterritorialize takes on unsynchronized shapes and forms. To elaborate, imagine the socius as a massive container ship, and the containers themselves are the encoded surpluses of codes and values that make up the whole of history up to this point. Each container is stacked upon another, closed tight and wedged in to make maximal use of space. The symbolic order is in a point of stasis, but also at maximal surplus, ready to explode and overflow. Now imagine that the ship tips over, containers go flying, but all at different rates and speeds. This, in effect, is the decoding process. A wave of violent, vengeful, inevitable capital has rocked the boat. Values and encoded forms are decoded at different rates, and capital is creating a relentless offensive in an effort to decode, but it cannot decode all at once. Some things go before others. Some things are held back. You can have evangelical Christianity and gender abolition within a relatively tight geographic location, and indeed, time and geography become unstuck in this way. This is the practical reason for constructions of architectures of horror, to map and to generate a pattern of mimicry of the decoding process, to explore new plasticities as they happen in periodized fashion. Through horror, capital does not feed back to us the anxieties it generates so much as it tips its hand about what is to come. This partially establishes the logic behind architectures of horror, but it does not explain why they are generated so much as it does how. Why does capital generate such spaces? How are these spaces possibly aberrations of a decoding process in crisis? Up until this point, this essay has referred to capital sustaining a strata of deterritorialized financial capital, the body of capital money, while intermittently reterritorializing the socius insofar as it still exists, the sphere of culture. Unfortunately, this has been a massive oversimplification. Capital is not merely a historical force haunting history, as Fisher suggests, or even a process of decoding invoked in reference to Deleuze. It is these things, but in its most technologically upgraded, paranoid, and frenzied state, it is most accurately described as a rogue AI. Not in the literal sense, of course, but in the functional historical sense. As it was regarded by Deleuze, capital represented a schiz, or a wall, and a limit for human value systems that produced both its intended output and its greatest nemesis, the schizo. However, what is not fully articulated in this statement is that capitalism itself is not just schizo or engendering schizos, rather it is itself a schizo. Capital mimics the dysfunctional and paranoid attitudes of the schizo, and itself becomes a reflexive machine capable of anticipating and reacting to imminent threats, even if it does so while creating great strain for itself. Capital creates a problem from which it is also ailing, almost as if lashing out. Existential problems of the economic or political variety can be annihilated at will, no matter the scale. Even more impressive in complexity is the paradoxical social codes it can adapt, a hallmark of the schizo, in order to accomplish this. Saddam is a friend until he is not. America is the guarantor of liberty, even if it is a state sponsor of terrorism. Capital never demands of itself any consistency, though once again, these are merely behaviors, not a formal functional mechanic. To get to the particulars of that, Nick Land's essay, if it can even be called that, Hypervirus, is of some help. Land states, well, he states a lot of things. It's not super important, but it'll be up on screen. This is more meth-fueled conceptual art than it is academic philosophy, but from it, there can be gleaned a sort of proto-hyperstition, or better put, an understanding of capital as a virus machine. It was never invented, and it haunted history only to arrive by accident. Who could have predicted this? The people bankrolling the Dutch East India Company? What about the factory owners at the birth of the Industrial Revolution? Was their goal the totalizing global system of today? Did they, or could they, have ever envisioned the undead body of technic capital that wreaks such havoc in the present? Even if the capitalist did not mean for capital to take shape like this, it is then aberrative, and therefore produces aberrative processes. It produces viruses, hyperviruses, and indeed architectures of horror are one of these hyperviruses, an accidental aberrative space field of dense narrative intensity, otherwise known as a horror movie.